Friends, when I came last Sunday, I promised 2 meditations on the theme of hope. Last week we talked about a famous story about Martin Luther, and this Sunday our inspiration comes from Martin Luther King Jr. Hope is a theme that I find myself returning to again and again because I feel that the folks in my congregation are really struggling with hope in these times and searching for hope and trying to figure out what hope means in these times. And so we've been, these sermons are really a product of that communal wrestling. So in that spirit, I just offer our reading, which is a poem by George Ella Lyon called Growing Light. I write this poem out of darkness to you who are also in darkness because our lives demand it. This poem is a hand on your shoulder, a bone touch to go with you through the hard birth of vision. In other words, love shapes this poem. Love is the fist that holds the chisel. It's the muscle that drags marble and burns with the weight of believing a face lives in the stone, a breathing word in the body. I tell you, though the darkness has been ours, words will give our eyes, opened in promise, a growing light. So about a year and a half ago, when the inauguration of our current president happened to fall on the birthday of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I took some time to puzzle over that ironic coincidence and reflect on it by rereading the text of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, his 1963 address from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And as I've read and reread that speech over these last 18 months now, seems longer, I've found that there's one line in it that especially speaks to my heart in this moment. This difficult season that we have found ourselves in for our nation, for our world. A line that I've pondered and puzzled over many times in the last year and a half. Among the many hopeful things that Dr. King said on that August day over 60 years ago was this line. He said, "We shall hew from the mountain of our despair a stone of hope." We shall hew from the mountain of our despair a stone of hope. It's powerful imagery, right? A stone of hope. A whole mountain of despair. Imagine that. A sorrow so profound, a hopelessness so overwhelming, it feels like an enormous mountain. Maybe some of us can. I've got a lot of respect for Dr. King that in a speech that otherwise leans heavily into hope, he doesn't shy away from acknowledging this despair of ours. He's not afraid to go there, to touch that pain and that sorrow and that anger, because it's real. It was real for the people he addressed back in 1963, and it's real for many of us today. The state of the world sometimes leaves us feeling like we're carrying a whole mountain of sorrow on our shoulders. But what he says next I find very interesting. He says that from this mountain of despair, from that hard rock, that granite, we will fashion our stone of hope. The stone of hope comes from the mountain of despair. It's of the same substance, right? A lasting hope, he's suggesting, is a hope born of despair, a hope tested in hardship and struggle, a hope that is hard won. Not just some warm feeling that keeps floating down from on high. Dr. King is speaking about the kind of hope that I think we need to fashion today for ourselves. From our mountain of despair, a stone of hope. But how? It's $1 million question, right? How do we shape a stone of hope out of our mountain of despair? How do we take our anger and fear and sense of injustice and sometimes hopelessness, how do we take all of that and fashion it into a hope as stolid and sturdy as a rock? I think Dr. King points a way in this passage. I think he's trying to give us a way forward. You know, Dr. King was always very careful about the words that he chose. And in this passage, he uses the verb to hew. H-E-W, hew. We shall hew from the mountain of our despair a stone of hope. It's not a verb we use too often. Hew, meaning to cut, as in stone. Hew, meaning to form something laboriously, as statue from a marble. Hew, meaning to adhere strictly to something as a rule or practice or discipline. To hope, says Dr. King, is to hew. It is a discipline, a practice, a labor. It does require the hard work of shaping something beautiful from the sometimes hard and difficult raw material of our lives. And in the situation we find ourselves in today, to hope is to hew. And as I've been thinking about what that might really mean for us in concrete terms, an old story came to my mind. You maybe have heard the old Japanese folk tale about the stone cutter. Have you? The story goes that once upon a time, the stone cutter had been laboring away at his task, patiently, faithfully chipping away at the mountain with his hammer and chisel, chipping away. But one day a royal procession came by, and the stonecutter saw a prince riding in a chariot, and suddenly the stonecutter felt small and frustrated by the futility of his work, chipping away at an enormous mountain. At this rate, he'd never accomplish his task. He said, if only I were a prince, then I could move not only mountains but armies. And as the story goes, his wish was granted. But after many hours outside in the sun, dressed in his princely robes, in the chariot, the man found the heat unbearable. He said, the sun is even more powerful than the prince, and I wish I were the sun, and again his wish was granted. The following day the clouds came out and hid the sun, so the stonecutter asked to become the cloud. But then a mighty wind blew and buffeted the clouds about, and he wished to become the wind. He became the wind. But no matter how hard the wind blew, it couldn't move the mountain. And so finally the stonecutter wished to become a mountain, large and strong. And there he was, the mountain, looking out from his summit. He felt indomitable until far below he heard the chipping of the stonecutter. And it made him tremble. When Dr. King invites us to hew from the mountain of our despair a stone of hope, I wondered if he didn't have in mind this stonecutter. To hew a mountain can feel like an insurmountable task when all we've got is our hammer and chisel, right? Sometimes we wish there were a shortcut to tearing down that mountain, a quick fix to the predicament we find ourselves in. Like the stonecutter, we sometimes say to ourselves, if only, right? If only we had more power. If only we had a different majority on the Supreme Court. If only. What kinds of if onlys do you find yourself crying out for? If only what? If only what? Let's hear some. If only so another party was in charge. Right. If only what?
If only everybody would vote.
If only everybody voted, darn it all. Yes, right. But if only everybody cared about the environment. If only. Peter, you've got one. If only we got younger instead of older, then we'd have the strength to move mountains. But there are no shortcuts. And there's no one else who's going to swoop in and save us. And the sooner the stonecutter realizes this, the better. Right? When Dr. King says to hew, he's suggesting that our work is like the stonecutters. Slow work, patient work, work that requires our perseverance. Work like writing a whole bunch of postcards to voters on Thursday nights, right? Yeah, right? Work like standing out on 5 corners for whatever protest is there every week after week. The only thing that can make it faster, the work, the only thing that can lighten our load is when we work together, right? Stonecutters, side by side, chipping away together, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand. This is the theory of power and change that Dr. King offered his movement and ours. It's not the power of kings, but the power of ordinary folks just like us, stonecutters. Chipping away at the mountain. That's right. To hope, says Dr. King, is to hew. But there's another image that comes to my mind when I think of to hew. And I wonder how many of you have been to Washington, D.C. and seen the Martin Luther King Memorial there on the Jefferson, on the reflecting pool down there. It's one of my favorite memorials in D.C. And the entire memorial is inspired by the same text that I'm preaching from today. We shall hew from our mountain of despair a stone of hope. And indeed, you can tell because the memorial consists primarily of an enormous block of granite, right? A mountain of granite, from which the Chinese sculptor Lei Yixin has carved a statue of Dr. King, but it's a statue that's not fully formed. It's almost like bas-relief, like the image is emerging from the granite, right? The sculptor's point, I think, is that Dr. King's work remains, unfinished, right? Not fully formed. Our stone of hope is a work in progress. But what the memorial reminds me of is that it's not only stonecutters that chip away at mountains, it's sculptors too, it's artists. There's a wonderful story about Michelangelo and his most famous sculpture, David. Legend has it that when Pope Julius II first saw the David, he was amazed and asked the sculptor how he had created a work of such beauty from a mere block of stone. To which Michelangelo replied, "I saw the angel in the marble, and I carved until I set him free." Michelangelo's craft wasn't merely that of hammer and chisel. It was also about his ability to see in the rough stone a beauty that others couldn't, right? A beauty waiting to be revealed. This was Dr. King's talent too, right? He had a vision, he had a dream. He could look at the mountain of despair and see it clearly for what it was, but also see the beauty hidden in the stone. He could see segregation and also imagine a time when when justice rolled down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. To hope is to hew, and to hew is not only to possess the strength and perseverance of the stonecutter, but it's to see in the rock a beauty that others can't see. Friends, we face a whole mountain of hurt and injustice and despair, and we got to see it for what it is. We got to measure its height and fathom its depth and take it seriously. But we also have to be able to find the beauty present in our world, right? We've got to see it. We've got to draw it out. We've got to live into it. We've got to create that beauty in our lives. Friends, the angel in the stone is us. It's the beauty of our own reflection, our own hopes and dreams, waiting to be set free. From our mountain of despair, a stone of hope. I'm going to close by just saying a final word about that stone. We haven't gotten to the stone yet. We've been talking a lot about the mountain of despair. We haven't talked about the stone of hope. Again, Dr. King has given us a powerful image, right? If you want, just for a moment, just close your eyes and make a fist. And just imagine what it feels like to hold in your hand a stone of hope. Feel its weight and its heft and its solidity. Feel the power, all the potential energy that's locked up inside that stone waiting to be released. It brings me right back to Michelangelo and his David. Remember that in the Bible, we first encounter David as a young boy, right? A shepherd. A shepherd whose people are being terrorized and bullied by a giant named Goliath. Right? And when no one else will step forward to stop the bully, David does. And what does he do? What does he use? He's got nothing more than his slingshot and his rock. His stone of hope is what he uses to fell that bully, Goliath. Friends, we now hold that stone in our hand. We can feel its weight, its strength, its power. But that's not all I feel. These days, lately, I can feel Goliath